This is my true story. I was married for 40 years. I believed love was about patience, loyalty, and care. I gave my youth, my dreams, my strength to a man who said he loved me. But one evening, he looked at me and said, "You're too old for love." I smiled, but inside, something broke. I realized he no longer saw me as a woman, only as a habit. However, a month later, something happened. Before I tell you what, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now, and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. He said it like it meant nothing. We were sitting at the table, dinner half cold, the TV murmuring in the background. He didn't even look at me when he said it. "You're too old for love." The words came out so easy, like he was describing the weather, not breaking someone's heart. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had cooked for him for years, washed his clothes, comforted him when he was sick. My hands looked older, yes, but they still worked. My heart still beat. But in that moment, he made me feel invisible. I didn't cry. I had learned long ago that crying in front of him only made him feel right. So I smiled instead, pretending I didn't care. Inside, though, something sharp turned in my chest. I realized I had spent years shrinking myself to fit into his idea of what a wife should be. Quiet, soft, grateful. And now that I was older, he wanted to shrink me even more. I sat there listening to him complain about the food, about the noise outside, about the news. But all I could hear was that one line echoing in my mind: too old for love. After he went to bed, I stayed up in the kitchen. The clock ticked loudly in the empty room. I touched my reflection in the dark window. The face looking back at me wasn't the same woman he married, but it wasn't worthless either. I thought about how much life I had given to others: my husband, my children, my home. When was the last time anyone gave anything back to me? I couldn't remember. It felt like I had spent my whole life pouring myself out until there was nothing left. The next morning, I acted as if nothing happened. I made his tea, ironed his shirt, and watched him leave for work. But as soon as the door closed, I sat down and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The silence of the house felt heavy but peaceful. I didn't feel broken. I felt awake. I began to notice small things I had ignored for years. How he never said thank you. How he never asked how I felt. How he looked past me like I was just furniture. That evening, when he came home and turned on the news, I watched him carefully. His hair had turned white. His back hunched a little when he walked. He was old too, maybe older than me in spirit, but he never admitted it. Men like him thought age only applied to women. He still believed he was the same charming man from his youth. I almost pitied him. Almost. When I lay in bed that night, his words came back to me again, but they didn't sting anymore. They started to sound foolish, even small. Too old for love. What did that even mean? Love isn't about age. Love is about being seen, being valued, being alive. And I was still alive. I realized that he couldn't see love anymore because he had stopped living it. Somewhere along the way, he had turned bitter, not because I changed, but because he stopped trying. For the first time in years, I fell asleep thinking not about him, but about myself. About who I had been before I became a wife, before my world became four walls and a man's moods. I remembered the girl who used to read novels, who dreamed of travel, who laughed easily. I missed her. I wanted to find her again. Maybe I still could. Maybe being old didn't mean love was over. Maybe it meant I finally had the chance to love differently. The next morning, I woke up early and opened the curtains. The sun was bright, soft, and warm. I made my tea slowly, enjoying every sip. I didn't tell him, but I made a promise to myself right then. I wouldn't spend another day proving my worth to someone who couldn't see it. I would live for myself now. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I would find out. His words may have tried to end me, but they only began my story. I spent most of my life serving a man who never really saw me. The early years were full of promises and small moments of happiness. He used to bring home flowers, tell jokes, and talk about the future. But as time passed, those flowers stopped coming, and the laughter turned into complaints. The house stayed clean, the meals were cooked, and yet I became invisible in my own home. Every day looked the same. I woke up early, worked all day, and went to bed listening to him snore. I called it love back then, but now I see it was habit. I gave him everything, my time, my patience, my youth. When I looked at him, I saw my partner. When he looked at me, he saw someone who would always be there. I became his shadow. He never asked what I wanted, never noticed when I was tired. I used to think that's what marriage was, giving without asking. But years later, when he started complaining about my wrinkles and my gray hair, I realized he had stopped seeing the woman who had stood beside him. To him, I was just old, familiar, unimportant. There were nights when I sat alone in the kitchen after he went to sleep, staring at my reflection in the window. I didn't recognize the woman I saw. The spark in her eyes was gone. The laughter lines had turned into deep creases from years of silence. I used to love singing while I cooked, but even that stopped. He said my voice was too loud, so I learned to hum quietly. Slowly, I lost pieces of myself until there was barely anything left. He liked control. He decided what I wore, where we went, what we ate. He said he wanted what was best for me, but what he really wanted was comfort, his comfort, and I gave it to him. I told myself it was fine, that at least he stayed, that staying meant love. But love isn't staying out of duty. It's choosing someone even when life changes. I chose him every day. He stopped choosing me long ago. When our children grew up and left home, the silence became louder. There were no excuses left, no distractions. Just the two of us sitting at the table pretending everything was normal. I tried to talk about travel, about seeing the sea again like we did when we were young. He said travel was for fools wasting money. I tried to talk about hobbies, about joining a club or volunteering. He laughed and said I was too old for that too. That's when I started to understand. It wasn't about my age. It was about how small he needed me to be to feel big. Years went by, and I lived like a ghost in that house. Friends stopped visiting because he didn't like noise. My laughter faded. Even my clothes grew dull because bright colors didn't suit my age. Every time I looked at him, I saw the man I once loved, and it hurt to realize that love had turned into endurance. I didn't know when it happened. Maybe it was the first time he dismissed my dreams, or the first time he compared me to other women. All I knew was that the woman he once held close was gone, buried under years of being told she was less than she was. Still, I stayed. Not because I couldn't leave, but because I had forgotten who I was without him. That's what happens when you give too much for too long. You start to disappear. But sometimes it takes one cruel sentence to bring you back. You're too old for love. That night, his words didn't just hurt me. They woke me. They showed me how many years I had wasted trying to make someone love me who no longer could. I promised myself then that I wouldn't waste any more. If love had left my house, maybe it was waiting for me somewhere else. I didn't know it yet, but those years I thought were lost were about to become my strength. The pain I carried, the patience I learned, all of it would lead me to something new. I was done being invisible. The years he ignored me became the years that prepared me for the moment he'd regret every word he said. The morning after that cruel sentence, I woke up different. Something inside me had shifted. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself for a long time. The woman staring back wasn't weak. She was tired, yes, but not finished. I saw wrinkles and gray hair, but I also saw strength, lines written by years of survival. I realized I had been living like a shadow for too long. That day, I decided to change. I didn't need to be younger. I just needed to be myself again. I started small. I cut my hair short for the first time in decades. My husband frowned when he saw it, said it made me look even older. I didn't argue. I smiled because I liked how it felt. Light, free, easy to care for. That was the first thing I'd done purely for myself in years. Then I opened my wardrobe and removed the clothes I never liked. The dull saris, he said, look proper. I bought new ones, in colors that made me feel alive again. Bright blue, deep red, soft yellow. When I wore them, I didn't care about his opinions anymore. I cared about my reflection. After that, I began to step outside. I started going for walks in the park. At first, it felt strange to walk alone, but soon I realized I enjoyed it. I talked to people, shopkeepers, old women feeding birds, even children playing. They smiled at me, not because I was someone's wife or mother, but because I was me. I had forgotten what that kind of attention felt like. It wasn't romantic. It was human. It reminded me that I still mattered. One morning, I saw a small poster outside the community center. It was for a local charity looking for volunteers to help cook for elderly people living alone. My first thought was, I could do that. My second thought was, would he allow it? That's when I caught myself. I realized I didn't need his permission anymore. I went inside and signed up. That single decision changed everything. The first day at the charity felt like breathing after years underwater. I met other women, some widows, some divorced, some just lonely. We shared stories, laughter, and work. For hours, I chopped vegetables, packed meals, and handed them to people with smiles. When I came home that evening, my husband asked where I had been. I said, helping others. He rolled his eyes and said, "At your age?" I didn't respond. His words no longer touched me. I had found something he couldn't control, purpose. Days turned into weeks. My world began to grow. I was no longer trapped in the kitchen waiting for someone to notice me. People at the charity respected me, thanked me, asked for my advice. I felt useful again, not for cleaning floors, but for who I was. My laughter returned, slowly at first, then freely. When I heard it, even I was surprised. It sounded like the woman I used to be. One afternoon, while serving food at a fundraiser, a man approached me to thank me for my work. He was older, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He asked me how long I had been volunteering. We spoke for a while, just small talk, but it felt easy, natural. He didn't look at me like I was old or invisible. He looked at me like I was someone worth listening to. I didn't know who he was at first, and I didn't care. It was enough that someone finally saw me as a person again. When I went home that day, I didn't tell my husband. He wouldn't have cared. But I knew something had started inside me. A small, quiet change. I no longer needed his approval. I no longer measured my worth by his words. I had found a new kind of confidence, one that came from living, not from being loved by someone who stopped trying. The next morning, I looked in the mirror again. The same wrinkles, the same gray hair, but I smiled differently. I wasn't waiting to be loved anymore. I was becoming someone who could love herself again. That's when life began to open new doors, doors my husband would never believe I could walk through. That day at the fundraiser changed everything. I almost didn't go because I felt tired, but something inside me pushed me to attend. The hall was bright, filled with people talking, laughing, moving around with purpose. I hadn't been part of something lively in so long that it almost overwhelmed me. I stood near the corner, helping arrange food trays when a calm voice thanked me for my work. I looked up and saw him, a tall man with silver hair, kind eyes, and a quiet smile. He wore a simple suit, nothing flashy, but there was something about his presence that felt strong yet gentle. He asked me how long I had been volunteering. I told him I had just started. He said it was rare to see dedication like mine. I didn't know what to say, so I smiled and nodded. We talked a little more, about the charity, about the people it helped, about how life changes when we decide to step outside our comfort. There was nothing romantic about that first meeting, only warmth, a reminder that real kindness still existed. When he moved on to greet others, I watched him shake hands, speak to staff, and listen, truly listen, to everyone. It had been years since anyone listened to me like that. Later, one of the organizers whispered that he was the main donor, a billionaire who funded hospitals, schools, and homes for the poor. I was surprised. He didn't act important. He acted human. That small detail made me curious. The next few times I volunteered, I saw him again. Each time, he would stop by to talk for a few minutes. He remembered small things, that I liked jasmine tea, that my grandson studied engineering, that I used to paint when I was younger. No one had remembered things about me for a long time. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just kindness. But the way he looked at me wasn't pity, it was respect. He saw me, the woman behind the wrinkles, the one who had stories, skills, and worth. Slowly, our conversations became longer. We spoke about books, music, the small joys of life. Things I had stopped sharing with my husband long ago because he never cared. Talking to this man reminded me that I still had a voice worth hearing. One evening, after the event ended, he offered me a ride home. I refused at first out of habit, afraid of what people would say, but he smiled and said, "It's just a ride, nothing more." The way he said it made me feel safe, so I agreed. The car was quiet, clean, and smelled of fresh roses. We didn't talk much during the ride. I looked out the window, thinking about how strange life could be. One sentence from my husband had pushed me into a world where I felt alive again. When I reached home, he thanked me again for my time at the charity. No one had ever thanked me for just being me. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because of guilt, but because I felt awake in a way I hadn't felt for years. I realized how long it had been since someone's kindness made me smile for no reason. It wasn't about love yet. It was about recognition, being seen without judgment. That feeling itself was powerful. Over the next few weeks, we continued to cross paths. He encouraged me to join more programs, to use my experience to help others. He even introduced me to his staff, saying, "She's the kind of person every team needs." Those words stayed with me. My husband had stopped saying kind things decades ago. Hearing them again reminded me that I wasn't done living. One afternoon, during a small break at an event, he said something that made me laugh. A real laugh, loud, free, the kind that comes from the heart. It startled me because it had been so long since I'd heard that sound from myself. I covered my mouth, embarrassed, but he smiled and said it was good to see someone laugh like that again. For a moment, I felt young, not in years, but in spirit. When I went home that night, I didn't tell my husband about the man or the fundraiser. I knew he wouldn't understand. He had already decided I was too old to feel joy, too old to matter. But as I changed into my night clothes, I looked at my reflection and whispered to myself, maybe he was wrong. I didn't know then just how wrong he would turn out to be. After that fundraiser, my life started to change quietly. The man I met, the billionaire, kept his word. A few days later, someone from his office called to ask if I would help with a new project. They said he had recommended me. I was surprised. No one had ever recommended me for anything before. For most of my life, I was the one helping in the background. No title, no credit, no thanks. Now someone important had noticed me. It felt strange but good. I accepted the offer before I could talk myself out of it. The project was simple. They needed someone experienced with managing kitchens and organizing volunteers for food distribution drives. That was something I had done all my life. Cooking for hundreds wasn't new to me. The only difference was this time people respected my effort. They asked for my opinion. They listened when I spoke. I wasn't just someone's wife here. I was needed. The first week I worked harder than I had in years, but every evening I came home smiling. When my husband asked why I was always busy, I told him it was for charity work. He laughed, said I was wasting time, said the man who hired me was only being polite to an old woman. His words didn't hurt like before. I had stopped expecting kindness from him. His mockery sounded small compared to the encouragement I got from others. Every time I walked into that foundation office, people smiled, greeted me, thanked me. I didn't need my husband's approval anymore. I had found my own worth. A few weeks later, the foundation organized a big event to celebrate their new community program. I was asked to stand beside the founder, the billionaire, as one of the senior contributors. When I heard that, my first thought was disbelief. Then I felt nervous. I had never stood on stage before, but he reassured me. He said I had earned it. So, I agreed. The day of the event, I wore a clean white sari, simple but elegant. As I entered the hall, cameras flashed. People clapped. It felt like a dream. On stage, when the billionaire introduced the team, he mentioned my name with pride. He said I represented the heart of the foundation. Those words echoed in my ears for days. My husband had spent years calling me useless, ordinary, invisible. Now a man the whole city respected was calling me the heart of something important. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, not as a wife, not as a mother, but as myself. That feeling was worth more than any money. After that day, reporters came often to the foundation. They took pictures, wrote small stories. Sometimes they asked for my quote. I didn't say much, just spoke honestly about why I volunteered. My photo began appearing in local papers. When I saw it the first time, I didn't tell my husband. I kept the paper folded neatly inside my drawer. It was my secret victory. He wouldn't have understood anyway. But people around the neighborhood began to notice. They asked him about me. Some even congratulated him for having such a respected wife. That bothered him. He started watching me closely, asking where I went, what I did, who I spoke to. He grew jealous, though he never said it out loud. For years, he had enjoyed being the one in control. Now he didn't know how to handle the fact that others admired me. The billionaire continued inviting me to events. Each time he treated me with kindness and dignity. He never crossed any line, never made me uncomfortable, but his presence alone reminded me of everything I had missed in my marriage: respect, attention, peace. We began to talk more often, not just about work, but about life. He told me about his late wife, how he missed her calm nature. I told him about my small dreams, to see new places, to help more people. He listened with care, the way no one had in decades. The day my husband told me again that I was too old for love, I smiled instead of arguing. I had already learned that love doesn't always mean romance. Sometimes love means being valued, respected, and seen. I didn't need him to understand it. I just needed to live it. What I didn't realize then was that this attention, this new light I had stepped into, would soon change my life completely, in a way my husband could never have imagined. After I started working with the foundation, I noticed my husband becoming quieter. He didn't ask how my day went or where I had been. He just watched me from behind his newspaper, pretending not to care but clearly bothered. I used to tell him everything I did, every little thing that happened, hoping for even a small reaction. Now I stopped talking because his silence said enough. The distance between us grew without words. At first, I thought it was guilt. Maybe he realized how hurtful he'd been. But it wasn't that. He was angry. Angry that I had changed, that I was no longer sitting at home waiting for his approval. For years, he had been the center of my small world. Now I had found a world of my own, and he couldn't control it. That made him uncomfortable. He began to make little remarks again, small ways to remind me of my place. He'd ask why I was always dressed so nicely, who I was trying to impress, why I smiled so much these days. I ignored him. The old me would have explained, tried to make him understand. The new me didn't need to. I realized that I wasn't angry at him anymore. I was simply done. Days turned into weeks. I started spending more time at the foundation. The work made me feel alive. I planned events, coordinated volunteers, and even trained younger women who joined. The billionaire often came by to check on progress. He always greeted me first, asked about my health, and thanked me personally. Small gestures, but they meant more than years of empty words from home. One afternoon, he introduced me to a few journalists visiting the foundation. He said, "This is the woman who keeps us running." I smiled politely, but inside, I felt something shift again. Pride. For so long, I had felt invisible. Now people saw me, appreciated me. It wasn't vanity. It was recognition, something I had earned with work, not luck. When I got home that evening, my husband didn't even look up. The television was loud, showing the news. My photo flashed for a moment during a report about the foundation's new program. He saw it, paused, and frowned. "Why are you on TV?" he asked. I said, "Because I work there." He shook his head, muttering something about showing off. I didn't reply. It didn't matter what he thought anymore. From that day, I stopped cooking for him. I stopped cleaning after him. I still did my chores, but I no longer did his. He noticed but didn't dare say anything directly. Instead, he complained to neighbors that I was too busy playing charity. They smiled politely, but I knew they didn't believe him. They had seen the newspaper articles. They had seen me leave every morning in a car that wasn't mine. They had seen me change, not in wealth, but in dignity. The billionaire and I began working closely. He was never inappropriate, always respectful. But his warmth, his constant support, reminded me of something I had long forgotten. That companionship doesn't have to fade with age. It doesn't have to disappear just because someone else stopped offering it. He made me feel capable, confident, alive. My husband made me feel tired. the difference was clear. Slowly, our conversations at the foundation grew more personal. He would tell me stories about his life, his family, the loneliness that wealth couldn't fix. I told him about my youth, how I once dreamed of becoming a teacher but ended up staying home because that's what my husband wanted. He listened carefully, sometimes shaking his head, sometimes smiling sadly. Those talks were the first time in years I felt like my heart was being seen, not just my face. At home, the distance had become silence. We didn't fight. We didn't talk. We simply existed under one roof like two strangers who shared nothing. He sat in his chair, and I sat by the window, reading or writing notes for my next project. The television filled the room, but there was no connection between us. He had pushed me away long ago, and now that I was gone in spirit, he finally noticed what loneliness truly felt like. Every time he looked at me, I could see confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand who I was becoming. He didn't realize that the woman he had dismissed as too old for love was finally learning to love her own life. He didn't realize that this distance he created would soon become permanent, and that it would destroy him in a way my silence never could. One night, everything changed. I came home late from a foundation dinner. It had been a long day, full of meetings and interviews. The new community project we launched had been covered by every news channel. I didn't realize how much attention it had drawn. I changed out of my sari, sat down, and turned on the television to catch the replay of the event. My husband was already in the living room, half asleep, his dinner untouched. The channel switched to a live broadcast. The billionaire was standing at a podium, cameras flashing all around him. He was talking about the foundation's next steps. Then suddenly, the screen zoomed out, and I saw myself beside him. I didn't know they would show that part. I stood quietly at his side, holding the folder with project details, smiling as he spoke. My name appeared at the bottom of the screen. Foundation co-chair, Mrs. Name. For a moment I froze. Then I saw something else appear on the banner. The words that would change everything. Philanthropist appoints new co-chair and life partner. I didn't even have time to process it before I heard a gasp from the sofa. My husband sat up straight, his eyes glued to the screen. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His hand trembled, pointing at the TV. There I was, the woman he had mocked, dismissed, called too old for love, standing next to a man the whole city respected, a man announcing me not only as his co-chair but his future partner. My husband turned pale. The color drained from his face. I could hear his breath quicken. Then, before I could say a word, the remote fell from his hand, and he collapsed forward. I rushed to him, calling his name, shaking him. For a few seconds I thought he had died, but he was breathing, shallow and weak. I called the neighbor for help, and they helped me get him onto the sofa. When he opened his eyes again, the television was still showing my face. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to explain. I hadn't planned for any of this to happen. The billionaire had decided to make the announcement public that night. He hadn't told me beforehand because he wanted it to be a surprise, not as a show, but as a declaration of trust. He had told me earlier that he wanted me to be more than just part of the foundation. He wanted me to share his life, his purpose, his vision. I had thought he was speaking metaphorically. I didn't know he meant it literally. As I sat next to my husband, I realized how ironic life could be. For years, I believed I wasn't enough. I believed that my worth had faded with my youth, that my love story had ended long ago. But now, the world saw me differently, not because I changed my face or my age, but because I finally learned to respect myself. That respect drew people who saw my value, and that in turn made me realize how small his insults had been all along. When the neighbors left and the house grew quiet again, my husband sat staring at the blank screen. He didn't speak. He didn't shout. He just looked lost. For once, he was the one who didn't have control, who didn't have the last word. I wanted to feel sorry for him, but I couldn't. There was a strange calm inside me, not pride, not revenge, just peace. The kind of peace that comes when truth finally balances out years of pain. That night, I packed my things, not out of anger, but clarity. I wasn't running away. I was moving forward. As I folded my saris and kept my jewelry in a small pouch, I thought about all the nights I had stayed awake crying quietly so he wouldn't hear. Those nights were over. Tomorrow, the world would wake up to a new story. Not of a man who left his wife behind, but of a woman who refused to stay invisible. When I looked at him one last time before leaving, he was still staring at the dark screen, his reflection faintly visible. It was almost poetic. The man who said I was too old for love was clearly not ready for the surprise that's about to hit him. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Newspapers, television, social media, my face beside his. Billionaire announces partnership and new life companion. I woke up to dozens of calls. Reporters wanted interviews. Strangers sent congratulations. I sat at the edge of the bed holding the phone, unable to move. It felt unreal. I hadn't planned this. I didn't expect any of it. Downstairs, my husband was still weak. He hadn't spoken much since last night. When he finally did, his voice trembled. He asked if it was true. I said yes. He asked how long I'd been hiding it. I said nothing. There was nothing I could explain that he would understand. Years of silence had built a wall between us. Now it stood taller than ever. By afternoon, neighbors started coming by. Some were curious. Some pretended to be supportive. I heard whispers outside the gate. They said I had become famous overnight. They said I had married for money. None of them knew how much I had lost before gaining this peace. They only saw the end, not the years that came before it. My husband stayed inside. He didn't eat. He didn't answer the door. He kept the television off. For the first time, he didn't want to hear my name. Every knock on the door was another reminder that his words had turned against him. He once told me I was too old for love. Now the whole town was calling me the symbol of second chances. Life had a strange way of correcting itself. That night, I sat alone at the dining table. The house felt heavy. I thought about leaving quietly, without a scene. I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance. I wanted air that didn't smell of resentment. So, I packed again. My clothes, my jewelry, a few books, everything fit into one suitcase. I looked around the house one last time. Every corner carried memories of silence. I felt no attachment left. Before I walked out, I left a letter on the table. I wrote, "You told me love ends with age. You were wrong. It ends with cruelty. And when cruelty ends, life begins again. I didn't sign it." He would know it was from me. When I stepped outside, the driver from the foundation was waiting. He greeted me politely and opened the car door. I looked up at the house, the same windows I had once stared from while waiting for him to come home. Now I was the one leaving. The irony wasn't lost on me. The sound of the car starting felt like a door closing for good. As we drove through the city, I saw my own photo on a billboard. It was a campaign for the charity, my face beside the billionaires. We looked like two people who had built something meaningful together. For the first time, I believed it. It wasn't about romance or wealth. It was about respect, partnership, and hope. Things I had been starved of for decades. That night, we attended another event. Reporters swarmed the entrance. The billionaire guided me through the crowd gently, making sure I felt safe. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. I stayed calm, smiling softly. I wasn't acting. I was at peace. Somewhere across the city, I imagined my husband watching the same scene, alone, realizing the difference between ownership and love. When I returned home days later to collect a few more things, the house was empty. He had gone to stay with relatives. The walls were quiet, the air still. My letter was gone from the table. Only my reflection remained in the dark window, not the reflection of an old, tired woman, but of someone reborn. I closed the door behind me gently and didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I felt no fear of being alone. I wasn't abandoned anymore. I had simply chosen a new life. He fainted at the sight of my happiness, but I stood tall in it. The woman he called too old had become something he could never be, free. After I left, silence followed me like a shadow. But it was a calm kind of silence, not the heavy one I had lived in for years. I stayed at a small apartment arranged by the foundation. The first night there, I sat on the bed and listened. No shouting, no mocking, no sighs of disappointment, just peace. It felt strange at first, almost too quiet. But then I realized that quiet was freedom, not loneliness. I had waited a lifetime for this sound. The next morning, I received dozens of messages, some from reporters asking for interviews, others from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old friends who once avoided me now wanted to meet. Even distant relatives sent polite congratulations, pretending they had always cared. I read every message carefully, smiling at the irony. When I had nothing, they disappeared. Now that I had recognition, they remembered me. I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't need their approval anymore. My husband, on the other hand, couldn't face anyone. I heard from a neighbor that he rarely stepped outside. The same people who once praised him for being a strong man now whispered about how he had lost everything, not money but dignity. People pitied him, and that wounded his pride more than anything else. I didn't feel happy about his misery. I just felt done. He had built a life where my worth was measured by my usefulness. Now he was learning what life feels like without me. At the foundation, things moved fast. The billionaire and I became partners officially, not just in title, but in purpose. We worked side by side every day. Meetings, travels, conferences. He treated me as his equal. He often asked for my opinions before making big decisions. I had never experienced that kind of respect before. For years I had been told to stay quiet, to let others decide. Now my voice mattered. I spoke less, but when I did, people listened. Once, during a press conference, a journalist asked me if I felt strange finding love again at my age. I didn't get angry. I just said, "Love doesn't have an age. Respect doesn't have a limit." The room went silent. I saw the billionaire smile quietly beside me. That was all the answer I needed. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I was just living what should have been normal all along. Being valued, being seen, being free to be myself. Days turned into weeks. My husband tried to call a few times. I didn't pick up. He left messages saying he wanted to talk, that people were laughing at him, that he was sorry. Maybe he was. But his sorry came too late. Sorry after years of cruelty is just noise. I had nothing left to give him. I had already spent all my forgiveness on the years he took from me. Sometimes at night I thought about the past, not with pain, but with understanding. I realized that I had allowed myself to shrink because I believed love meant sacrifice. I thought being quiet made me good. I thought patience would bring peace. It never did. Peace came only when I chose myself. That was the hardest lesson of my life. One afternoon, I went to the same park where I used to walk alone before everything changed. People there recognized me now. Some smiled, some waved. A few came up to thank me for my charity work. I didn't tell them the whole story. I just smiled and said thank you. Inside, I felt something that had been missing for years. Pride. Not pride in the attention or the title, but pride in surviving, in not letting bitterness consume me. My husband fainted when he first saw the truth on television, but I knew it wasn't shock that broke him. It was realization. He saw what he had thrown away, a woman who was never too old for love, just too loyal to the wrong man. He learned too late that love grows where respect lives. He had none left to give, so I found it somewhere else. That was the consequence of his cruelty. Not my revenge, but my freedom. And that freedom became the loudest answer to everything he ever said. Justice didn't arrive like thunder. It came quietly, like the morning sun after a long, dark night. I didn't plan to punish anyone. I only wanted peace. But life has its own way of balancing things. For years, I thought endurance was strength. Now I understood that walking away with dignity was the real victory. My husband had spent his life proving how much power he had over me. In the end, I didn't fight him. I just stopped giving him that power. That was the beginning of justice. I settled into my new life slowly. The foundation became more than a workplace. It became my home. The billionaire, my partner, treated me not as a trophy, not as a miracle, but as a person. He respected my ideas. He trusted my choices. We built schools, shelters, and programs for women who had been abandoned or forgotten. Every face I saw reminded me of who I used to be. Quiet, fearful, waiting for kindness that never came. I made sure they never had to wait like I did. That was my purpose now. Sometimes reporters asked me about my past. about the man I left behind. I never said his name. I didn't need to. My silence spoke enough. I didn't want revenge. I wanted to show that a woman's worth doesn't vanish with age or neglect. I wanted every lonely woman watching the news to know she wasn't finished just because someone told her she was. Justice wasn't about seeing my husband fall. It was about seeing myself rise. One afternoon, months later, I heard he had sold the house. He couldn't bear to live there alone. The walls reminded him of the woman he had silenced, and now those walls echoed with his own loneliness. He moved into a small flat, away from everyone. People said he had grown bitter. I didn't feel hatred for him anymore. I felt pity. He had chosen pride over love, and pride doesn't keep you warm when the nights are long. The billionaire and I continued working together. Our bond grew deeper, not rushed, not forced. It wasn't about filling a void. It was about sharing peace. We didn't need grand words or promises. We just understood each other. When he looked at me, I didn't see pity or surprise. I saw respect. That was love, in its purest form. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Every now and then I received letters from women who had read about me. They said my story gave them courage to start over. One wrote, "You made me believe it's not too late." That letter made me cry, not from sadness, but from gratitude. I had spent years thinking my life was over. Now, my story was helping others find new beginnings. That was justice too, turning pain into purpose. Sometimes at night, when the world is quiet, I sit by the window and think about the past. I remember the woman who used to stay up waiting for her husband's approval. I remember her tears, her silence, her fear of being unwanted. And then I look around me, at the books, the flowers, the photographs from our charity events, and I whisper to myself, "You made it. I don't need applause. I don't need apologies. I just need this peace." Justice doesn't always mean punishment. Sometimes it's a mirror held up to the ones who doubted you. My husband once said I was too old for love. Now, every time my face appears on television beside my partner, he is forced to see what love really looks like. Not youth, not beauty, but dignity. That's what he never understood. In the end, I learned something simple. Life gives back what you give yourself. I gave myself forgiveness, and the world gave me freedom. I stopped begging for affection and started building respect. I stopped living small to fit into someone else's comfort. And when I did that, the world opened wide. He fainted at the sight of my happiness. I stood firm in it. That was the final justice. Not revenge, not victory, but peace. A peace earned through years of quiet endurance. A peace that said, without words, "You were wrong about me. I was never too old for love. I was just waiting for someone to see me."